The chandeliers burned like captured stars above the grand ballroom, their lights spilling over silk gowns, polished marble, and faces trained to smile without warmth. Isabella stood near the edge of the crowd, her hands folded tightly before her, every breath reminding her that she did not truly belong here, no matter how beautiful the blue gown wrapped around her body. She had been invited as a courtesy, a quiet favor from a distant aunt, and she knew the rules well enough to stay invisible. Across the room, the Duke laughed among powerful friends, his presence commanding attention without effort, while his mother, the Duchess Dowager, watched everything with cold, measuring eyes. Isabella felt that gaze settle on her like ice, sharp and unblinking. She tried to turn away, but the orchestra swelled, the dancers shifted, and suddenly the Duchess was before her, close enough that Isabella could smell bitter perfume and hear a breath drawn tight with judgment. The music faltered as the Duchess spoke words meant only for Isabella, words that cut like knives, accusing her of ambition, of shamelessness, of daring to stand where she did not belong. Isabella opened her mouth to answer, to defend herself, but the sound never came. In one swift, shocking motion, the Duchess raised her hand and struck her across the face. The slap echoed through the hall like a gunshot, silencing every whisper and freezing every step. Pain flared across Isabella's cheek, but worse than the pain was the humiliation, the sudden heat of tears she refused to let fall. Gasps rippled outward, dresses rustled, and someone dropped a glass that shattered against the marble floor. Isabella swayed, but did not fall, her eyes lifting slowly to meet the Duchess's triumphant stare. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then a voice rang out, loud and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. Enough! The word carried authority, not shouted, but firm enough to make the chandeliers seem to tremble. Heads turned as the Duke stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight with something dangerously close to fury. He moved to Isabella's side without hesitation, placing himself between her and his mother, an unthinkable breach of decorum that sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. The Duchess's face hardened, her lips thinning as she hissed his name, but he did not look at her. Instead, he looked at Isabella, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a guest or an inconvenience, but as a person who had been wronged. Isabella's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She had never been defended like this, never been chosen. The Duke turned then, his voice steady as steel, and demanded an explanation for the violence his mother had inflicted. The Duchess scoffed, claiming insult, impropriety, a threat to the family's honor, but her words sounded hollow now, stripped of power by the simple fact that everyone had witnessed the slap. The Duke raised his hand, silencing her, and announced that the ball would pause until Isabella was treated with the respect owed to any guest under his roof. Shock spread like fire. No one remembered a Duke ever contradicting his mother so publicly. Servants hovered uncertainly, nobles whispered behind fans, and the orchestra sat frozen, bows hovering above strings. Isabella felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden shift, by the attention she had spent her life avoiding. She tried to speak, to say it was nothing, to beg him not to make a scene, but the Duke gently shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. He offered his arm, a simple gesture that carried immense meaning. And though her instincts screamed to retreat, something deeper urged her forward. As she took his arm, the room seemed to tilt, alliances reshaping themselves in silent calculations. The Duchess watched them with a fury that promised consequences, but for now she was powerless. The Duke led Isabella from the center of the ballroom to a quieter alcove, murmurs trailing them like shadows. There, away from the crowd, he asked softly if she was hurt. The kindness in his voice broke something inside her, and she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He called for water, for a physician, for anything she might need, and she realized with a strange ache that no one had ever asked her such questions before. As servants rushed to obey, the Duke stood guard, his presence a shield against the world. Isabella pressed her fingers to her burning cheek, her thoughts racing. She knew this moment would change everything. The slap had not just bruised her skin, it had torn away the fragile safety of anonymity she had clung to. Now she was visible, chosen, and that terrified her as much as it thrilled her. Across the hall, the Duchess gathered her composure, already plotting how to reclaim control, but the balance had shifted. Somewhere behind them, the orchestra slowly began to play again, tentative notes filling the space with uneasy life. Isabella listened, her heart still pounding, and wondered what price she would pay for the Duke's defense, and whether she was strong enough to face what would come next. Music resumed with a fragile elegance, as if the orchestra itself feared provoking another scandal, and Isabella felt every note vibrate through her bones while she sat in the alcove beside the Duke. Servants hovered at a careful distance, offering water and whispered reassurances, but the room beyond seemed miles away, unreal and distorted. The Duke dismissed the physician with a curt nod after confirming the slap had done no lasting damage, though the red mark on Isabella's cheek still burned like a brand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The Duke stood close enough that Isabella could feel the warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breath, and it unsettled her more than the Duchess's cruelty ever had. Finally, he broke the silence, apologizing not as a noble fulfilling a duty, but as a man ashamed that such a thing had happened under his roof. His words were simple, unpolished, and that honesty made her throat tighten. Isabella tried to respond with the practiced humility she had learned over years of surviving on the edges of society, but the Duke gently interrupted, telling her she owed no apology, no explanation, nothing at all. The statement felt dangerous, almost forbidden, and she lowered her gaze, unsure how to exist without the armor of self-blame. From across the ballroom, she could feel eyes on them. Curiosity sharpened into speculation, alliances already shifting as people calculated what this moment meant for their own fortunes. The Duchess had retreated to a circle of loyal supporters, her posture rigid, her smile fixed, but her eyes burned with a promise of retaliation. Isabella knew that look well. It was the same look worn by those who believed power excused cruelty. She wondered, not for the first time, what kind of woman one became after decades of ruling through fear. The Duke followed her gaze and stiffened, his jaw tightening, and for a fleeting instant Isabella saw the child he must once have been, standing small beneath a towering will. He spoke then, quietly but firmly, telling her that his mother's behavior would have consequences, words that sounded impossible even as he said them. Isabella looked up in shock, reminding him that the Duchess Dowager was not a woman accustomed to being corrected, least of all by her own son. He met her eyes and said that perhaps that was the problem. The simplicity of the admission stunned her. They were interrupted by an announcement that the next dance would begin, a deliberate attempt by the master of ceremonies to restore normalcy. The Duke hesitated only a moment before offering his hand, asking Isabella if she wished to leave or to stay. The choice felt heavy, symbolic, and Isabella's heart pounded as she realized how much hung on her answer. Leaving would spare her further scrutiny, but staying would mean standing openly at his side, daring the world to judge. She thought of the years she had spent shrinking herself, making herself smaller to avoid notice, and felt a quiet, unfamiliar resolve settle in her chest. She placed her hand in his and said she would stay. The Duke led her back onto the ballroom floor, and a hush fell once more, followed by a ripple of astonishment. They moved together in the dance, the Duke guiding her with a confidence that steadied her trembling steps, and soon the rhythm carried her beyond fear, beyond thought. She became aware only of the pressure of his hand, the sound of her breath, the sweep of her gown. Whispers swirled around them like ghosts, but none dared interrupt. When the dance ended, applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling, not for the music but for the defiance of it all. Isabella felt her cheeks flush again, this time not from pain, but from a strange, fragile pride. The Duchess did not clap. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on them with a cold intensity that made Isabella's skin prickle. As the evening wore on, Nobles approached one by one, offering polite words, strained smiles, and thinly veiled questions, all while measuring Isabella, as if she were a puzzle newly worth solving. She answered as best she could, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The Duke never left her side. At one point, he guided her onto a terrace overlooking the gardens, where the night air was cool and fragrant with roses. Away from the crowd, Isabella finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. The Duke apologized again, this time for placing her at the center of a conflict she had never asked for. She surprised herself by telling him the truth, that the slap had hurt, but the years of being ignored had hurt far more, and that being seen, even like this, felt strangely freeing. He listened without interruption, his expression softening, and confessed that he had long resented the fear his mother wielded, the way she ruled through humiliation rather than respect. He admitted that her behavior toward Isabella had crossed a line he could no longer ignore. The honesty between them felt like standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. Inside, the Duchess was already setting her plans in motion. She summoned her closest allies, her voice low and venomous, framing the incident as a calculated provocation, a scheming girl manipulating her weak-willed son. She spoke of duty, of lineage, of the dangers of allowing sentiment to cloud judgment, and her listeners nodded, eager to align themselves with power. Rumors began to spread, subtle and poisonous, painting Isabella as an ambitious interloper. By the time the ball ended, the palace buzzed with speculation, the story already being reshaped to suit different agendas. Isabella returned to her modest quarters that night, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Duchess's raised hand, felt the shock of the slap, heard the Duke's voice cutting through the silence. She wondered what consequences would follow, whether she would be quietly exiled from polite society or thrust further into its glare. Dawn crept through the window, pale and uncertain, and with it came a knock at her door. A servant delivered a sealed note bearing the Duke's crest. Her hands trembled as she opened it, reading his request to meet privately later that day. The words were formal, careful, but beneath them she sensed urgency. Isabella pressed the note to her chest, her heart racing. Whatever had begun in that ballroom was far from over, and she knew, with a mix of fear and resolve, that her life would never return to what it had been before the slap. Morning light filtered through tall windows as Isabella dressed with careful hands, her thoughts racing faster than her heartbeat. The Duke's sealed note lay open on the small table, its elegant script etched into her mind. She replayed every word, searching for hidden meaning, for danger, for hope. When the servant returned to escort her through quiet corridors usually forbidden to guests of her standing, she felt the weight of each step, aware that walls had ears and whispers traveled faster than truth. The meeting room was modest by palace standards, a deliberate choice that spoke of discretion rather than display. The Duke was already there, standing near the window, his back straight, his expression thoughtful rather than commanding. When he turned and saw her, relief flickered across his face, unguarded and human. He greeted her not as a subject or scandal, but simply by her name, and that alone eased some of the tension coiled inside her. He asked again if she was well, if the night had been kind to her, and listened closely as she answered honestly, admitting that sleep had eluded her. He confessed the same, saying the events of the ball had forced him to confront truths he had long avoided. He spoke of duty drilled into him since childhood, of a mother who believed fear was the surest path to loyalty, and of his own silence, which had allowed her cruelty to flourish. Isabella listened, struck by the vulnerability in his voice, realizing how rare it was for a man in his position to admit doubt. He told her that by striking her, his mother had crossed from private tyranny into public disgrace, and that the court now waited to see how he would respond. The words settled heavily between them. Isabella understood at once that his defense of her had placed him at odds with the most powerful woman in the duchy, and that any further step would deepen the divide. She tried to absolve him, insisting she had never intended to become a weapon in a family war, but he shook his head, saying that injustice demanded response, regardless of intent. He revealed that the Duchess had summoned him at dawn, demanding he issue a statement condemning Isabella's supposed impropriety. He had refused. The refusal, he admitted, had been met with threats, not shouted, but delivered with icy precision. Titles, alliances, even succession had been invoked as leverage. Isabella felt a chill at the implications, realizing the cost of his defiance. She told him she would understand if he chose to distance himself from her to preserve peace, that she would quietly leave the palace and spare him further conflict. The suggestion pained her more than she expected. The Duke stepped closer, his gaze steady, and said he would not sacrifice another person's dignity to avoid his mother's wrath. He explained that he intended to establish clear boundaries, to make it known that violence and humiliation would no longer be tolerated at his court. Such a declaration would be unprecedented and dangerous, but he believed it necessary. He asked her, gently, whether she would be willing to stand firm if the backlash fell on her as well. Isabella felt fear rise like a tide, but beneath it was a stronger current of resolve. She thought of every time she had bowed her head to survive, every injustice swallowed to keep the peace. She met his eyes and said she was tired of being silent. The Duke nodded, a trace of admiration in his expression, and promised to do everything in his power to protect her. News of their meeting spread quickly despite their efforts at discretion. By midday, the Duchess's supporters were already weaving narratives of manipulation and seduction, portraying Isabella as a calculated threat to the established order. Invitations were quietly withdrawn, conversations halted when she entered a room, and servants grew cautious, uncertain whose favor would prevail. Isabella felt the isolation keenly, but she was not alone. The Duke ensured she was included at his side during meals and councils, a visible sign of his stance that infuriated his mother. The Duchess confronted Isabella directly that afternoon in a sunlit gallery, her voice smooth and venomous, accusing her of ambition and deceit. Isabella, trembling but unyielding, replied with calm honesty, stating she had sought neither power nor protection, only respect. The exchange drew witnesses, and though the Duchess masked her fury, the challenge had been issued. That evening, a formal notice was posted announcing a tribunal to address the incident at the ball, framed as a matter of decorum and honor. The court buzzed with anticipation, aware that the outcome would redefine the balance of power. Isabella returned to her chambers overwhelmed, knowing she would be questioned, judged, and dissected before an audience eager for spectacle. As night fell, she stared out at the gardens, wondering whether courage would be enough to carry her through what awaited, and whether the Duke's promise could withstand the storm about to break. The tribunal convened beneath a vaulted ceiling heavy with carved symbols of lineage and law, the air thick with incense and anticipation. Isabella stood at the center of the chamber, her posture straight despite the tremor in her hands, aware that every eye measured her worth in silence. Rows of nobles filled the seats, their expressions carefully neutral, while guards lined the walls, reminders that authority here was enforced as much as it was debated. At the far end, elevated on a carved dais, sat the Duchess Dowager, her composure immaculate, her gaze sharp as glass. Beside her, though slightly lower, was the Duke, his presence a visible declaration that this proceeding would not unfold as it always had. The tribunal opened with formalities, voices droning through rituals meant to convey fairness, though Isabella sensed how fragile that promise was. Accusations were presented first, delivered by a court advocate loyal to the Duchess, painting Isabella as a provocateur who had violated unspoken rules of hierarchy through improper familiarity and ambition. Each word felt like a stone thrown carefully to wound, without leaving obvious marks. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some faces nodding in agreement, others flickering with doubt. When Isabella was asked to respond, her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to breathe, remembering the Duke's steady gaze, his faith in her resolve. She spoke clearly, recounting the events of the ball without embellishment, describing the public nature of the insult and the shock of the slap. She did not beg for sympathy or lash out in anger. She spoke only of dignity, of the belief that no guest deserved violence regardless of rank. The simplicity of her words unsettled the room. When the Duke was called to testify, tension spiked like a drawn blade. He rose and addressed the tribunal not as a son defending a slighted mother, but as the sovereign of the court responsible for its conduct. He confirmed Isabella's account and condemned the act of striking a guest as a violation of both custom and conscience. Gasps broke out openly then, the unthinkable spoken aloud by the man whose duty had always been obedience. The Duchess responded with icy scorn, dismissing the charge as sentimental weakness and asserting her authority as matriarch, reminding the tribunal of traditions that placed discipline above compassion. The exchange revealed a deeper fracture, not just between mother and son, but between old power and emerging principles. Hours dragged on as witnesses were questioned, servants recounting what they had seen, nobles carefully choosing words that would not doom them whichever way the decision fell. Isabella stood through it all, legs aching, heart pounding, aware that her future balanced on every breath. At last, the presiding magistrate called for deliberation. The chamber emptied slowly, leaving Isabella alone with the Duke for a moment that felt both intimate and unbearable. He told her quietly that regardless of the outcome, he did not regret standing up to his mother. The sincerity in his voice steadied her as she was escorted away to wait. When the tribunal reconvened, the verdict was delivered with measured gravity. The Duchess's action was deemed inappropriate and publicly censured, a symbolic punishment softened by her status, yet unprecedented in its acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Isabella was cleared of all accusations, her conduct affirmed as honorable. A collective exhale swept through the chamber, relief and outrage mingling in equal measure. The Duchess accepted the censure with a frozen smile, but her eyes burned with humiliation and rage. The Duke formally announced new protocols to protect guests and servants from abuse, a reform that sent shockwaves through the court. As the assembly dispersed, alliances shifted visibly, some nobles flocking to the Duchess in whispered loyalty, others gravitating toward the Duke, sensing change. Isabella was congratulated by a few brave souls, avoided by many more. That night, alone again, she felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a sober understanding that the verdict had ended nothing. The public judgment had drawn lines in bloodless ink, but private battles would follow, and the Duchess was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. In the days following the tribunal, the palace settled into an uneasy calm, like a field after a storm where the ground remained soft and treacherous beneath the surface. Isabella moved through corridors that now felt narrower, the air charged with unspoken judgments. Some servants greeted her with newfound respect, their eyes warm with gratitude for the changes the Duke had announced, while others avoided her entirely, fearful of being associated with a woman who had challenged the old order. The Duke, burdened by governance and the backlash of reform, could not always remain at her side, and in his absence the weight of isolation pressed harder. Whispers followed her, stories twisted and retold until truth became unrecognizable, painting her as either a heroine or a schemer, depending on who spoke. Isabella focused on small routines to steady herself, long walks in the gardens, quiet hours with books, moments where the palace's grandeur faded into something almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm, tension brewed. The Duchess had withdrawn from public appearances, a strategic retreat that unsettled even her most loyal allies. When she reemerged, it was with calculated grace, offering apologies laced with ambiguity and hosting gatherings framed as gestures of unity. Isabella sensed the performance for what it was, a repositioning rather than surrender. Invitations arrived for Isabella to attend these events, each one a test of courage. Declining would be seen as weakness, acceptance as provocation. She chose to attend. At the first gathering, the Duchess greeted her with chilling politeness, every word measured, every smile sharp. Conversations faltered as Isabella passed, guests uncertain which side they were expected to favor. The Duchess steered discussions toward tradition and stability, subtly reinforcing the idea that the recent upheaval threatened the duchy's foundations. Isabella listened, aware that silence could be interpreted as agreement. When given an opening, she spoke carefully but firmly about respect, about strength that did not require cruelty. The room stilled, tension crackling like static. Some nodded thoughtfully, others bristled. The Duke watched from across the room, pride and concern mingling in his expression. That night, rumors reached Isabella of letters sent to influential families, questioning her background and intentions. Her modest origins were dissected, her past scrutinized for any flaw that could discredit her. The pressure intensified, and Isabella felt the familiar urge to retreat, to disappear before the scrutiny consumed her. But the Duke's reforms had already begun to take effect, emboldening servants and lesser nobles to speak out about abuses long endured. Their gratitude fueled her resolve. One evening, the Duke confided that his mother had begun lobbying foreign allies, hinting that his rule endangered long-standing alliances. The stakes were rising beyond personal conflict into political threat. Isabella suggested she step away from court life to defuse tensions, but the Duke refused, insisting that yielding now would validate his mother's tactics. Instead, he proposed a bolder strategy: transparency. He would convene an open forum, inviting grievances and testimonies, exposing the truth to daylight where manipulation could not thrive. Isabella agreed to stand with him, knowing the risk. The forum drew a diverse crowd, voices shaking as stories of humiliation and fear were finally spoken aloud. Isabella listened, her heart aching, realizing the slap had been only one symptom of a deeper sickness. The Duchess attended, her expression unreadable as the narrative of absolute authority fractured before her eyes. The forum did not end the conflict, but it shifted momentum. Support for the Duke grew among those who had long suffered in silence. Still, threats arrived in subtle forms: social exclusions, economic pressure on Isabella's few remaining connections, anonymous notes warning her to remember her place. She burned the notes without reading them twice. Late one night, walking alone through the gardens, Isabella wondered how far courage could carry her before it demanded a cost she could not pay. The stars overhead offered no answers, only the quiet certainty that retreat was no longer an option. The cost made itself known sooner than Isabella expected. It arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with absence. One by one, familiar faces vanished from her daily life. A lady who once walked with her in the gardens was suddenly indisposed whenever Isabella appeared. A tutor who had offered quiet guidance was reassigned without explanation. Even servants who had shown kindness grew cautious, their warmth dimmed by fear of reprisal. The palace had learned to punish not through open violence, but through withdrawal, and the loneliness pressed on Isabella like a physical weight. She reminded herself daily that isolation was the preferred weapon of those who feared truth. Still, resolve did not erase pain. The Duke noticed the change before she spoke of it. He found her one afternoon seated alone in the winter gallery, staring at a tapestry without seeing it. When he asked what troubled her, she hesitated, unwilling to add to the burdens already etched into his face. But he insisted, and when she finally admitted how invisible punishments were being dealt, anger flashed in his eyes. Not the explosive kind, but something colder and more dangerous. He told her that this was exactly why the old system had endured for so long, because it harmed without leaving marks that could be condemned. He vowed to confront it, not with decrees alone, but by dismantling the networks that enabled it. His determination was both reassuring and frightening. That evening, he announced a series of administrative changes, reassigning key positions long held by the Duchess's loyalists. The reaction was immediate. Courtiers whispered of overreach, of instability, of a ruler letting personal sentiment cloud judgment. Isabella could feel herself being named in every accusation, spoken or unspoken. She began to wonder whether standing firm was bravery or selfishness, whether her presence truly served the greater good or merely sharpened the conflict. These doubts haunted her sleepless nights. Matters escalated when an incident occurred beyond palace walls. A merchant known to have publicly supported the Duke's reforms was suddenly accused of fraud, his goods seized, his reputation smeared. The pattern was unmistakable. The Duchess's influence extended far beyond the court, into guilds, councils, and foreign contacts. The Duke summoned Isabella after hearing the news, his expression grim. He admitted that his mother was testing how far she could push without provoking outright rebellion. He feared that soon the damage would spread to those less able to withstand it. Isabella listened, her chest tight with dread, and made a decision that startled even herself. She offered to speak publicly, not as a symbol protected by the Duke, but as a voice accountable to the people affected by the struggle. The idea was risky, almost reckless. The Duke resisted at first, fearing for her safety, but she argued that silence would allow others to define her narrative forever. If she was to be blamed, then she would at least be heard. Preparations were made in secret. A modest hall in the city was chosen. Invitations extended not to nobles alone, but to merchants, servants, and artisans. When the day came, Isabella stood before a crowd larger than she had imagined, her hands trembling, her heart racing. She spoke of the ball, the tribunal, and the reforms, but more importantly, she spoke of fear, of how power used without accountability corrodes everyone it touches. She did not name the Duchess, did not accuse directly, but the meaning was clear. The response was mixed. Some applauded openly, others watched in wary silence, measuring the consequences of association. Word of the speech spread quickly, reaching the palace before Isabella herself returned. The Duchess reacted with fury barely contained. She accused the Duke of orchestrating propaganda, of undermining noble authority by appealing to common sentiment. For the first time, the confrontation between mother and son erupted behind closed doors into open shouting heard by servants outside the chambers. Isabella was not present, but she felt the shockwave of it through the palace. That night, the Duke came to her, exhaustion etched deep into his features. He told her that his mother had issued an ultimatum. Either Isabella would leave the duchy quietly, or the Duchess would withdraw her support entirely, calling in favors that could destabilize trade and alliances. The threat was real. Isabella felt the weight of the choice settle on her shoulders. She could end the conflict by removing herself, sparing the duchy further turmoil, or she could stay and force the issue to its breaking point. The Duke did not tell her what to do. He only said that whatever she chose, he would respect it. That trust pierced her more sharply than any insult. Alone once more, Isabella walked the palace grounds under a moonless sky. She thought of the servants who now dared to meet her eyes, of the voices she had heard at the forum, of the merchant ruined for speaking up. She also thought of the Duke, standing alone against a legacy of fear. By dawn, she had made her decision. She requested a final meeting with the Duchess. The request was granted with cold amusement. In a private chamber heavy with history, Isabella faced the woman who had struck her. The Duchess spoke first, dismissive and sharp, warning Isabella that idealism was a luxury the powerless could not afford. Isabella listened, then answered with calm clarity. She said she would not leave, not out of defiance, but because leaving would teach the wrong lesson, that cruelty succeeded if applied with enough force. She acknowledged the Duchess's power, but denied her moral authority. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. The Duchess studied her, seeing perhaps for the first time not a convenient target, but a threat that could not be easily crushed. When Isabella left the chamber, her legs trembled, but her mind was steady. The line had been drawn, and there would be no quiet ending now. The aftermath of that meeting rippled outward with a quiet intensity that unsettled the palace more than open conflict ever had. The Duchess did not retaliate immediately. Instead, she waited, and in that waiting lay menace. Days passed in strained calm, each hour stretching thin as if the air itself might snap. Isabella felt eyes on her wherever she went, not openly hostile, but assessing, calculating. The Duke increased her security without comment, a silent acknowledgement that danger no longer hid behind manners alone. Messages arrived from distant councils questioning policies, trade routes faced sudden delays, and minor shortages began to surface in the city, inconveniences small enough to be dismissed individually, but together forming a pattern of pressure. The Duchess was tightening her grip on the levers she still controlled. The Duke worked relentlessly, meeting with advisors late into the night, forging new alliances where old ones frayed. Isabella watched the toll it took on him, the shadows under his eyes deepening, the weight of leadership pressing harder with each decision. She offered support where she could, listening, encouraging, reminding him why he had chosen this path. Their conversations grew more candid, less guarded, a shared understanding forming between them that went beyond politics. They spoke of fears rarely admitted aloud, of the loneliness that came with standing against inherited power. The bond that grew was not declared, not named, but it was unmistakable, a quiet partnership forged in resistance. The Duchess struck again, this time through the law. An inquiry was announced into the legitimacy of the Duke's recent reforms, framed as a concern for procedural integrity. Isabella was summoned as a witness, the implication clear that her influence would be scrutinized, her words twisted, if possible, into proof of manipulation. The hearing was tense, the questions sharp and leading. Isabella answered carefully, refusing to be baited into defensiveness or blame. She spoke of principles rather than personalities, of outcomes rather than intentions. Observers noted the restraint, the steadiness, and some doubts began to surface even among the Duchess's supporters. Outside the chamber, crowds gathered, waiting for news, their presence a sign that the conflict had spilled beyond elite circles into public consciousness. The Duke addressed them briefly afterward, reaffirming his commitment to reform and stability, his tone calm but resolute. The Duchess watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. That night, Isabella received an anonymous warning, slipped beneath her door, cautioning her to leave before accidents began to happen. She showed it to the Duke without hesitation. He reacted not with panic, but with resolve, ordering a discreet investigation that soon uncovered a web of intimidation orchestrated through intermediaries loyal to his mother. The evidence was damning, yet fragile, reliant on testimony from people afraid to be named. The Duke faced an impossible choice: expose the network and risk plunging the duchy into chaos, or allow the threat to linger, endangering those he sought to protect. Isabella urged him toward transparency, believing that half measures would only prolong suffering. He agreed, though the decision weighed heavily. A public declaration followed, outlining the intimidation efforts without naming the Duchess directly, but making clear that such tactics would no longer be tolerated. The response was explosive. Supporters of reform rallied openly, while traditionalists accused the Duke of eroding noble authority. The Duchess finally emerged to confront the narrative, issuing a statement asserting her innocence and warning of instability born from radical change. The court polarized completely. Isabella felt the strain acutely, moments of doubt creeping in when exhaustion overcame conviction. Yet each time she faltered, she remembered the faces of those who had spoken at the forum, the relief in their voices when heard at last. The Duchess requested a private audience with the Duke alone. The meeting lasted hours, and when it ended, the Duke emerged pale but composed. He told Isabella only that his mother had offered a compromise, partial withdrawal in exchange for preserving her remaining influence and ending public scrutiny. It was a tempting offer, one that could ease tensions quickly. Isabella saw the temptation in his eyes, the longing for peace, and did not begrudge it. She told him she would accept his decision, whatever it was. He studied her then and said that compromise with injustice only delayed its return. He declined his mother's offer. The consequences were swift. Several high-ranking nobles resigned in protest. Trade partners hesitated, and the duchy teetered on uncertainty. Yet something else happened too. Voices long silent began to speak, not just in support of the Duke, but in defense of a new vision of authority grounded in accountability. Isabella stood at the center of this storm, no longer merely reacting, but shaping events through presence and principle. She understood now that change was not a single victory, but a sustained act of courage. As the palace prepared for what many feared would be the final confrontation, Isabella felt neither triumph nor terror, only a steady resolve. Whatever came next, she would face it standing, not shrinking, and that knowledge was its own kind of power. The final confrontation did not announce itself with trumpets or formal summons. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine, until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. The Duchess requested a full council session, invoking an ancient provision rarely used, one that allowed a ruling matriarch to challenge the sovereign's capacity to govern in times of perceived instability. The request sent a tremor through the palace. Such a challenge, if successful, could strip the Duke of real authority without removing his title, reducing him to a symbol while power shifted back into older hands. Isabella learned of it through the Duke himself, who delivered the news with measured calm, though his eyes betrayed the strain beneath. He explained the process, the arguments that would be raised against him, the alliances already mobilizing in his mother's favor. Isabella listened, a cold clarity settling over her. This was no longer about reform alone. It was about whether the duchy would move forward or retreat in a fear once more. Preparations consumed the days that followed. Advisors debated strategy late into the night. Scribes compiled records of reform outcomes. Testimonies were gathered from across the city. Isabella assisted where she could, organizing accounts for merchants, servants, and officials whose lives had tangibly improved under the Duke's changes. Each story reinforced her belief that this struggle mattered far beyond palace walls. Still, doubt crept in during quiet moments. She wondered whether history would remember her as a catalyst for progress or a spark that burned too hot, too fast. On the morning of the council, the chamber filled with a gravity that eclipsed all previous gatherings. The Duchess entered last, her presence commanding attention, her confidence unshaken. She spoke first, her argument polished and relentless, framing the Duke's actions as reckless idealism that endangered stability and tradition. She spoke of unrest, of economic uncertainty, of a ruler swayed by personal influence rather than measured wisdom. When she finished, murmurs of agreement rippled through part of the assembly. The Duke rose in response, his voice steady, his posture unyielding. He did not deny the disruption change had caused. Instead, he embraced it, arguing that discomfort was the cost of correcting long-standing injustice. He presented evidence, not as an attack on his mother, but as a testament to the duchy's capacity to adapt and strengthen. When Isabella was called to speak, the chamber stilled. She felt the familiar tremor of fear, but no longer ruled her. She spoke not of the slap, not of personal grievance, but of accountability, of what it meant to be governed without fear. She reminded the council that stability built on silence was not stability at all, but stagnation. Her words carried not defiance, but conviction. The deliberation was long, the silence afterward almost unbearable. When the decision was announced, it was not a decisive victory, but it was enough. The challenge to the Duke's authority failed by a narrow margin. The reforms would stand. The Duchess's power, while not erased, was formally limited, her ability to act unilaterally curtailed by oversight she could no longer ignore. The chamber erupted into subdued reactions: relief, outrage, disbelief. The Duchess accepted the outcome without outward emotion, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer untouchable. In the days that followed, the duchy adjusted to a new reality. Resistance did not vanish, but it lost its sharpest edge. Isabella felt the change in subtle ways, in the ease of conversations, in the absence of anonymous threats, in the cautious optimism of those who had once whispered. The Duke, though victorious, did not celebrate. He understood the fragility of what had been won. One evening, standing with Isabella on the palace terrace, he admitted how close he had come to losing everything, and how her courage had steadied him when doubt threatened to undo his resolve. Isabella listened, humbled by the acknowledgement, aware that her life had become inseparable from the fate of the duchy. She did not know what the future would demand of her, only that she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. The night stretched before them, uncertain but open, and for the first time since the slap that had begun it all, Isabella allowed herself to believe that fear did not have to be the final legacy of power. Time did what conflict could not. It softened sharp edges without erasing memory, and slowly the duchy learned to breathe in a different rhythm. The Duchess withdrew from daily governance, her presence becoming ceremonial rather than commanding, a shadow of what it had once been. She retained dignity, even influence, but the fear that had followed her name like a chill no longer ruled the halls. The Duke settled into his authority with a steadier confidence, no longer defined by opposition alone, but by the quiet labor of building something fairer than what he had inherited. Isabella remained at his side, not elevated to a pedestal, not hidden away, but recognized for the role she had played. Her days filled with work she had never imagined for herself, mediating disputes, listening to grievances, shaping policies that balance compassion with practicality. She never forgot how fragile progress could be. There were setbacks, compromises that stung, voices that still resisted change, but the terror of arbitrary power had been broken, and that mattered more than perfection. The palace itself seemed to change. Corridors once heavy with tension, now carrying a cautious openness. Servants spoke more freely. Nobles debated rather than whispered, and the city beyond the walls reflected the shift, imperfect but alive with possibility. Isabella sometimes caught the Duchess watching her from across a room, not with hatred, but with something closer to reluctant acknowledgement, as if recognizing that history had moved beyond the rules she had mastered. The Duke and Isabella never spoke publicly of what bound them, yet their partnership was evident in every shared decision, every moment of mutual trust. It was not a story of sudden romance or fairy tale triumph, but of respect earned through fire. On quiet evenings, they walked the gardens where fear had once stalked Isabella's steps, now replaced by reflection. She thought often of the girl she had been before the ball, careful, unseen, convinced that survival required silence. That girl felt distant now, though not forgotten. The slap that had humiliated her had also awakened her, forcing a choice between shrinking and standing. She had chosen to stand. The duchy would continue to change, shaped by countless hands and voices, not just hers. But she knew her presence had mattered, that one act of cruelty had been answered by sustained courage. As seasons turned and the memory of scandal faded into history, the lesson remained, whispered in halls and taught in quieter ways. Power, when unchallenged, decays, but when met with conscience, it can be transformed. Isabella carried that truth with her, not as a burden, but as a compass. Whatever the future held, she would meet it not as a guest on borrowed ground, but as a woman who had claimed her place without striking another down.